Good afternoon. I'm Samantha Power, Senior Director for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights at the National Security Council here in the Obama administration. I am very pleased to be here today, joined by Jerry Fowler, the President of Save Darfur, Layla Amjadi, the Student Director of STAND, and of course, President Obama's Special Envoy to Sudan, Scott Gration. I personally am especially pleased to be here as a longtime Sudan watcher and as somebody with a deep interest in preventing mass atrocity and promoting human rights. Scott and I are very excited to launch this online town hall here at the White House with a community of activists represented by the two individuals here, but really all of you out there who have been literally critical to raising the profile of Sudan, South Sudan, of Darfur, and of the country as a whole. It is no secret that governments tend to have some difficulty turning to issues of this nature in a timely fashion, but your energy and your commitment over the years have made it impossible for governments to look away. And we here are those of us who are deeply embedded in this issue and deeply committed to moving the ball are deeply, deeply grateful to you for that energy, for that commitment, and for the fact that it gives people like Scott Gration wind at his back as he sets out to advance the president's objectives. This is an unusual online endeavor. We have been able to meet with advocates who are in Washington, D.C. General Gration is in close touch with them often, but this is an opportunity for us to open up the conversation and have a direct dialogue with you who are out there, not necessarily within the Beltway. We are eager to be doing this on whitehouse.gov, the State Department Facebook page, and of course the websites for Save Darfur and for STAND. You all have responded very exuberantly to this initiative, and we're very grateful for that. And I believe that the questions that Jerry and Layla put to General Gration and myself are those that come from you all across the country and all across the world. So thank you. And before we get into our substantive discussion, let me just allow General Gration to kick it off with a few opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Samantha. I just got back last weekend from a trip that took me to Istanbul, to Abuja, where we heard the unveiling of the Mbeki report and had an opportunity to meet with leaders from Africa. And then went to Juba and to Khartoum, where we were working hard trying to finish up the comprehensive peace agreement and to get closure on the last two issues, which are the elections and the referendum. And of course, the census is in there too, because that's really at the basis of the election issue. I'm leaving again this next weekend to go to Khartoum again, to go to Darfur, and also go to Abyei to make sure that the implementation remains on track because the timeline is so short. I look forward to this opportunity. It's great to be with you, Layla, and with Jerry, and I look forward to your questions and to this session with the advocacy groups.
Great. Jerry?
Okay. Yeah, well, thanks. We really appreciate your taking the time to speak with us today. I would be less than candid if I didn't acknowledge that there's been a lot of concern in our community over the last 11 months since President Obama took office. The administration seemed to be caught flat-footed when the International Criminal Court handed down the arrest warrant for President Bashir, and he responded by kicking out 13 major aid organizations. And then there was an extended period where we were waiting for this policy review to be done. You were appointed and worked incredibly energetically, have continued to work energetically, but there was confusion about what the strategy was. So now you've articulated the strategy. I think in general our community has welcomed it, but emphasized that what we'll be looking at is the implementation. Sudan, as you know, is a very volatile situation right now with the elections coming up, with the referendum scheduled in January of 2011, and civilian populations in Darfur remain very vulnerable, as well as the civilian population in the south. So this is a good time for us to sit down, and we appreciate you taking the time. Layla is going to ask the first question.
Yeah, sure, and thank you. Before I do, I just want to say on behalf of STAND, the student-led division of the Genocide Intervention Network. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here and to represent student activists across the country who have really mobilized around this issue and are deeply committed to seeing an end in the genocide in Darfur, as well as a very peaceful Sudan. As you know, this past weekend, STAND, along with its partner, Save Darfur, as well as Enough Project, as well as its parent organization, Genocide Intervention Network, convened a conference, the largest in the movement's history, upwards of 1,000 individuals here, to learn about more how they can be more active in these issues, to learn about the issues. And just yesterday, 500 of those activists went on the Hill to lobby for a successful implementation of the policy. So I think that really represents how deeply committed students are and activists are to seeing this policy be implemented successfully. And so my questions come from student activists around the country who have voted on what they would like for me to ask of you today. And my first question is, our first question is, the recent Sudan policy review stresses that incentives and pressures will be applied to Khartoum and other parties to the conflict based on concrete progress, or lack thereof, in the implementation of agreements and verifiable change on the ground. What indication will citizen advocates who are watching the situation closely have about how decisions about incentives and pressures are being made at any given time?
First of all, before I begin, let me say thank you very much for your participation and those who actively go on the Hill and attend conferences and are passionate about these issues. And I know you have a concern, and I know that we owe you answers on these things. But as we go through the deliberation process, much of this has to be inside of the administration and behind closed doors. So you're going to have to forgive me if I can't tell you exactly all the details about what you'll see. In fact, the process, as you know, as we announced, will be a process where quarterly we'll take a look at verifiable things that we can see on the ground, and then we'll measure the progress. We'll see if we're making the progress that we want to see, or if we're standing still, or even worse, taking steps back. And based on that, surely we'll come up with a mix of incentives and pressures that will get done those things that we and the international community thinks needs to get done. And certainly we're going to consult with Congress. We're going to let people know exactly what's happening. But much of that process is being worked out. But I can guarantee you that it will be a process that has measurable milestones, that we're looking for benchmarks, and we're looking to see if what is happening on the ground is in keeping with that. So as we make agreements, as we see decisions that are being made, we're going to take a look and put those into objective statements. Who's doing it, what they're doing, when it needs to be done by, and what is that expected standard of performance we're looking for. And then based on that, we'll take a good look at what's happening on the ground, what difference is being made, what behavior changes are we seeing that are telling. And then we'll turn that into incentives and pressures. Let me just step back right here and say, during the Cold War, Reagan administration came to an end, and President Reagan said that we have to trust and then verify. We have a situation here where we're going to verify and then trust. We're going to take a look at what's on the ground and verify those changes and then take follow-on actions. So I believe we have a good strategy, and now we have to put in verifiable ways of seeing the change, and then we have to figure out how we can communicate that to the advocacy groups and those who share a concern.
But can I just follow up on that for a second? Because the idea that there are benchmarks and then either they're met or they're not makes total sense. Mm-hmm. But if nobody outside of the government knows what the benchmarks are, then how can we know if they're being verified? I mean, there's a huge gap there.
You're exactly right. And that process right now is the process we're working through, exactly how we're going to turn. We now have stoplight charts. And so we're going to have to turn them into benchmarks that we can then measure. That's the process we're going through right now. As you know, the strategy just came out, and we're in the process of doing that. And this is why it's important to listen to you all, to see how and what information you need to make sure that we're being held accountable. But this is an ongoing process. It's being worked. And some of it obviously has to be behind closed doors. We can't lay all the cards on the table right now. And I'm not saying trust us, because that should not be the standard.
We're going to verify and then trust.
But you should. And we're in the process right now of coming up with a program that allows us to be transparent, that allows us to show. But I think you're going to see it on the ground. I think you're going to see progress that we all can look at. We're not talking about progress that we can't verify publicly. But you're going to see, hopefully, more stability and security in Darfur. You're going to be able to see the end of the conflict, whether it's at the proxy level between Chad and Sudan, whether it's at the local level with banditry and carjackings. Hopefully, you're going to be able to see the same metrics that we're seeing. In terms of the South, you're going to see us demarcating the borders. You're going to see things happening in ABA that show that we're implementing these agreements. So those things you won't be able, we're not going to try to hide, and you're not going to have any questions about. Where there's going to be more of a debate that's behind closed doors is, what is the administration going to do about inaction or backsliding? What is the administration going to do in terms of incentivizing? And those deliberations will be held at the Deputies Committee level, and you'll be able to see what comes out of there, but you will probably obviously not be part of the process.
So, General, you mentioned backsliding and adhering to certain and complying to certain resolutions and so on and so forth. And so yesterday, for example, the UN panel of experts released a report that said that there are many violations that the government of Sudan has done, as well as some other armed movements. Are those types of violations, do they warrant a trigger of pressure from the U.S. government?
Sure, we're looking at all those. But you mentioned a very important point. We don't have yet all the monitoring mechanisms that we need. In fact is, when the NGOs were expelled, we lost some very valuable NGOs that we haven't gotten back in yet. And in fact is, while we've been able to compensate for food and water and health care and sanitation, some of the protection NGOs have not been able to get back in. And UNIMID hasn't gotten the freedom of movement that they need to be able to monitor closely. So you put your finger on a very important point. For us to objectively verify, we're going to have different types of NGOs on the ground, and more of those kinds of NGOs on the ground. And we're going to have UNIMID with more freedom of movement and an ability to monitor better what's happening on the ground so that we can take action. And those are things we're working on right now. But that's an excellent point.
We have a question in a little while about the humanitarian situation in the wake of the expulsions. And one thing I should say, Save Darfur asked activists to submit questions, and so the questions that I'll be asking are from activists. And the first one that I wanted to give you goes back to this issue of indicators in a very specific area. It's from Martina Nee of San Francisco, and it addresses the elections that are coming up in April. And she asks, what actions are being taken with respect to the 2010 elections so that they do not result in a U.S. paid for and organized legitimization of President al-Bashir and the National Congress Party? Given the control by the NCP of the media, security forces, and all aspects of the election, the logistical challenges of the elections in Sudan, and the vulnerability of Sudanese voters, please outline all of the steps, or at least some representative steps, to be taken between now and the elections to ensure that they are truly free and fair. What are the indicators of free and fair elections that the U.S. government will be using?
That's an excellent question. Let me just put it into context a little bit. We believe that elections are so critical to full implementation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. You know, the spirit of that agreement was to do not only give the people of the South an opportunity to express their will in terms of whether they choose unity or secede and become independent, but it really was to transform Sudan, the political systems. And elections are so important to that process. And yeah, we've had the same question. Why would we do elections and especially if they're just executive elections, why would we do this? But when you step back and think about it, this will be the first time in 24 years that the people have had an opportunity to elect leaders at the national level and then, more importantly, at the legislative level. I've had an opportunity throughout the time that I've been an envoy, and especially this last week, I met with leaders from the UMA party, the DUP, and some of the parties in the South that are non-SPLM, and had an opportunity to talk to them, and every single one of them believe that the process is important so that they can do a couple things. One is have a legislature that's elected by the people that is making decisions about the referendum. Not only do they think it's important for the referendum, but they also think it's important to start down this road of political reformation. From my perspective, I agree with them totally. But on top of that, if we're going to have a referendum that is free and fair and credible, we need to practice those elements now. In fact, if we go into a referendum in January of 2011 without ever practicing, without ever going through the legislative process, voter registration, voter education, international monitoring, the administration of just putting balloting boxes out there and making sure that they're protected and safeguarded, making sure people can get to the polling places in a free and fair way without threats of violence or mischief, making sure that those ballot boxes are counted and kept secure, and that the public affairs and those kinds of things that are associated with election are done. If you do it for the first time for the referendum and you make a mistake, now think about what that's going to mean. All the people in the South and the North who wanted to have this referendum, and then it's invalidated because we didn't know the process. So let's start practicing right now those processes. So that's what we're doing right now, is we're going through the steps in this election and learning a lot. And because we have a little bit of time, we're getting the election laws passed. We're trying right now. What I was doing last week was working through the census and all those issues that surround how we're going to divide up the constituencies and that kind of thing. Then we're going to go through with the Carter Center, with international monitors, the folks from Norway and the Troika are contributing, folks in Europe. We're bringing the EGAD countries into this so that we have international monitors that are looking at the places. We've already been out looking at the polling places. On this next trip, when I leave, I'm going to 3 different registration areas. One just outside of Khartoum, one in Omdurman, and I'm trying to go to one in Darfur. We're already starting to get feedback about how the registration is going and problems that are being encountered and things that need to be fixed. And we're taking an active role along with the election committees and other people that are involved. We're also pretty soon going to have to make some big decisions about the election itself, the type of balloting that's going to take place, especially when you're talking about some places in the South where the literacy rates are down in the teens. How do you do this? You know, when folks can't read the ballots or understand what you're trying to say in written form. So there's a whole lot of issues we got to get through, but it's going to be challenging, but I'm confident we're going to make a great attempt to make sure that it's free, fair, and credible for the election, and then carry over those lessons learned and make adjustments that are required to ensure that the referendum is credible and that the people from Southern Sudan and Abyei have a chance to express their will on whether they should be independent or remain part of Sudan.
We could probably spend the rest of the time that we have talking about the elections because there are huge issues there. But there are a couple of things I wanted to make sure that I understood. And one was, I heard you say that you met with UMA party leaders and DUP, so northern opposition parties, and you share their interest in a legislature that can make decisions regarding the referendum. And that raises a lot of questions about whether the details of the referendum are going to be decided before there's an election, because a huge fear is that the NCP is going to engineer the results, and one of the things that they'll engineer is a majority in the resulting legislature that lets them unilaterally change the CPA.
Yeah, what we've done this last week, we stayed up the wee hours of the morning working on this. But as you know, we're trying to get it down to where there's a reasonable turnout, and that's being negotiated between the SPLM and the NCP, and also that we are able to ensure that the 50% plus one, or the simple majority that make the decision, that that really does represent the right people. So we're talking about a definition of who's a Southerner. We're talking about the polling places. We're talking about places outside of Sudan that can vote in the referendum, how this gets done. And so we're working through these right now. Where the issue that I talked about before is that that's fine when we're talking about the referendum, because that really is a CPA. That's a North-South issue.
So to be clear, the referendum, the idea is to have the referendum procedures and the process set before there's a new legislature.
Yeah, that is. However, what folks are worried about is that wrapped up in these decisions are the census and the election. And to some degree, the parties are being excluded because the negotiations are between the SPLM and the NCP. So what we're trying to do is make sure that Darfur gets included. Places like where the
It's included in what?
In the election process. And that parties like the UMA and others get a chance to play. And where they might not be big enough to play in the executive level election, they can play seriously in the legislative side. So as you might have heard, there was some talk about saying, move the legislative election down the road, because that's where the constituencies and that's where the census comes into play. And if you move the legislative election down the road, you don't have to get an agreement on the census. But that really excludes the other parties. So what we're trying to do is come up with a way that we can reach an agreement where the census can be accepted, where you can have full legislative elections, where you can have the other parties play in the electoral process, where they can become part of the system, and then they can have a vote in issues as they come up in terms of implementation of the referendum.
So again, I think we could talk about this a long time, and there are issues about the census in particular that I'd love to ask you about, but let me just limit the next question with regard to the elections to this. There was a report right after the policy review came out in the New York Times in the Week in Review on Sunday, and it had this phrase that said, General Gration and others say they will do everything they can to ensure fair conditions for the election, but they seem prepared to help deliver Mr. Bashir a political victory and a chance for legitimacy in order to keep Humpty Dumpty intact. And then the writer, Jim Traub, says that calculation may prove wrong, but it is hard to argue under the circumstances that the choice itself is morally obtuse. But is that accurate, that you are prepared to help deliver Bashir a political victory and a chance for legitimacy in order to keep Humpty Dumpty intact?
What we'd like to do is have a situation where all parties can put up candidates. And in fact, that's what we're working through right now. How does the NCP and SPLM and UMA and DUP all put up candidates in the national election and in the legislative election? So everybody has a chance to participate in this political process. We're not trying to guarantee an outcome. We're not trying to legitimize anybody else. We're trying to put into place a process that can not only be used in this election, but can be used in every single election from here on down the road. And this will be an iterative process. We will get better and better and better at it until someday free and fair elections will be just the standard way in Sudan. Yeah, this first election is going to be tough. It's going to be challenging. And there may be results that we're not happy with. But what we're trying to do is put into place the process of political transformation, and we're going to make sure that it is as fair and as free and as credible as possible.
Layla?
Our next question is, one major concern with regard to the current Darfur peace process and with previous agreements has been the failure to bring Sudanese civil society, those without guns, to the table. We know that the U.S. intends to reach out to civil society. However, the government of Sudan obstructed a promising civil society forum in the spring. What will you do if they take that kind of action again?
Well, this is exactly what the strategy is for. If they take that kind of action, there will be pressures. But the good part is that we've been working very hard on civil society and engaging with, especially with women's organizations and with youth, and bringing them into the process. In fact, as you might know, that on the 18th of November in Darfur, several hundred members of civil society will be meeting with the AU-UN mediator, Jibril Basholi, and facilitated by Qatar. And this is a very important process, and those consultations will be important as we think about land reform and compensation and those kinds of issues that are very important to the Darfuri people. We have to understand where civil society is coming from. And in my view, we have to listen to the women. It's been my experience in Africa that if you can help the women, you'll help the whole community. And that's what we're trying to do.
Not just in Africa.
Yeah, that's probably true. But I'm speaking from perspective of Africa right now. But if we can work these issues, if we can help provide livelihoods, if we can help get a path free so that they can have voluntary returns, these are such important issues, and the women will be so important. The other thing is we've got to work on the youth. You know, they represent the future. We've got to do skills training. We've got to be able to help them move into the next generation of Sudanese where they can be contributors. So again, as this conference happens in Doha, it's going to be very important that we get behind this. As we continue to work through the rebel unification and the conversion of rebels into political parties, there's got to be connection to the civil society, and we're working very hard on doing just that.
You mentioned bringing them into the process, and I think activists are really wondering, what does that actually look like for Sudanese civil society, specifically, you know, women? Does that mean having a seat at the table and being a party to the negotiations, or does that mean advising the negotiations and having their preferences represented?
Well, my view is that they need to be fully integrated. Right now, in fact, as I'll be giving a speech next week at a university in Omdurman, very prominent university for women. And the deal there is to encourage them not to just meet the quota of the 25%, which is in the Sudanese law, but to become part of the process, to get the training, to be involved, and to take their place at the table. They have to be part of the solution, and we'll certainly encourage that.
So in the room? Like
yes,
in the room.
Most definitely. Yeah.
Great.
Excuse me, can I just make sure I understand something? When you talk about this conference in Doha, which is being organized by the joint UNAU special mediator,
yes,
our chief mediator, Jibril Basalet, is that going to be the primary vehicle for civil society engagement? I mean, one concern is that there have been different initiatives, and that there, both with regard to civil society and with the peace process in general, that there only be one forum, one initiative, that the work that you're doing is coordinated with the work that Basalet is doing.
In terms of civil society, I think there's room for everybody to help. And the NGOs have programs. UNIMID has an outreach to civil society that is absolutely superb, and we want to piggyback on that. There's efforts to eliminate gender-based violence, and we all have to work very hard to make that. So what I'm trying to say is there's multiple avenues to work, and we need to work in all of them and maximize them all so that we can move Darfur quickly away from the dire conditions that there are out there today and into a place where the future is brighter. And I don't think that Doha is the only place for civil society. It may be the only place to put together the Darfur peace agreement and to maybe work a ceasefire with the rebels. So there's places where we need to use Doha. But when it comes to civil society, when it comes to political transformation, I think we have to use all the avenues that we have to ensure that we accomplish that in the most effective means as quickly as possible.
But I mean, with regard to creating a civil society voice that participates and has influence over the peace process, you've undertaken some work in that regard. Mm-hmm. Basalet is undertaking work. Are those parallel efforts, or are you working in concert with each other?
Very complementary. Very complementary. There's several different ways of attacking this. There's diaspora elites, there's folks on the ground, there's folks within the camps, there's folks that are distributed around in Khartoum and other places. We're actually trying to reach out to all those places and listen to them and get their views and make sure that everybody has a voice. And while we'd like to get a unified voice on things like compensation and land reform and how they want to see things get transformed, I think there's room at the table for multiple views. And so we're in the process of pulling that all together right now. And that's why on this last trip, I spent a lot of time, almost 2 full days, just trying to listen to the views of other people. So we don't get locked into NCP, SPLM groupthink, but that we listen to everybody. And so we went out to civilian places, to education arenas, and on this next trip, I'm going to Darfur. And we're going to be working hard to keep, this is a continuing process. There's just not one snapshot where you go to Doha and then it's over. This is something we're going to have to work on for a long time, because this really is going to demand a behavior change. It's going to demand a process change. And I don't think it's going to happen overnight, but we're going to work hard to make sure that we get as much done as we can in the shortest amount of time. Because really the future of Darfur depends on how fast we do this. Because we can bring as much as possible security and we can bring stability, but it's really the civil society, making sure that they have the dignity, making sure that we do this in a compassionate way that understands where they're coming from and the history that they've had. And so we have to understand civil society as much as we have to listen to them and do what they want us to do. And they have to lead this train. We don't live there. They do, and that's why we're spending so much time listening to them and in trying to incorporate their views. So when we say give voice to civil society, it is a voice so they can participate in their processes, but it's also a voice so we can listen to them. And so the NGOs and people like me and Basole and others, that we can do what they want in their country, create an environment so that they can have a future for their next generation that's bright.
Thank you. One of the points that was emphasized in the strategy document was the need for international engagement and U.S. leadership of international engagement. And so the next question touches on that, and it comes from Melanie Nelkin in Atlanta, Georgia. And she asks, one focus of the strategy document, well, what I just said, was the urgency in building multilateral support for the U.S. strategy. Historically, we have seen how the biggest players who back the NCP financially, namely China and Russia, have done little to influence their petro-arms business partner, the government of Sudan. Clearly, the previous administration had difficulties for years in trying to engage these countries from a humanitarian viewpoint without success. How does this new policy review change that? And then will you have any influence on the President Obama, in opening up this dialogue when he visits China, I guess coming up later this week, in the coming days?
Thank you, Melanie. And let me just start off, and then we'll let Samantha talk to the Obama administration. But one of the first things we did is to work very hard to build the international community, because you're exactly right. This problem can't be solved by America alone. It's going to take the whole international community to do that. So one of the first things we did is we put together this thing called the Envoy 6. And it was the envoys from the P5 countries, France and England and Russia and China, the United States, and then we also added the European Union. And in that, we found a very interesting thing, that while we were working Sudan bilaterally, we were able to do it in a multilateral context. And we found out that China and Russia need there to be stability and security. China to protect its $4 billion investment. The United States to protect the future for the Sudanese. So by having that common ground, those mutual goals, we're able to do things together on the humanitarian side, on the pressure, political pressure side, on the incentive side, to move forward towards security and towards stability. And yes, at the tactical level, there's areas where we differ, and we're working through those areas. But at the strategic level, the strategy side, there's so many areas where we have common ground, so many areas where we're working together to move Sudan forward in a way that brings more security, that brings more stability to the people, and to help guarantee a brighter future for them.
Could I just ask real quick, could you give a particular example of things China has done
Sure.
in coordination with you?
Yes. The envoy is Gration, and we've worked very closely together. He's gone to Juba, he's gone to Khartoum, he's gone to Chad to help us with the issues that we're doing. For example, the relationships between Chad and Sudan, ending the proxy war. He's been a tremendous ally. We're coordinating our humanitarian assistance so that instead of us building a 100-mile road and the Chinese building a 100-mile road, we're going to coordinate those so that we get a 200-mile road, not 200-mile roads next to each other. The same with wells. Why would we be putting in a borehole in the same city that the Chinese are doing it? And by coordinating our humanitarian assistance in a way, we can be more effective. These are small, but there's certainly a step in the right direction.
Will China join in the strategy of a balance of incentives and pressures? They haven't seemed to have much enthusiasm in the past for pressure.
Obviously, every country uses diplomacy and pressures and incentives for its own national interests. What we believe is that there's an area where the national interests of the United States and China, when it comes to policy towards Sudan, have a lot of overlap. And that's what we're trying to do. But in the end, we serve our national interests, they serve theirs. We're just trying to make sure that there's overlap as much as possible.
And if I could just add on that point and then address the question about the president's forthcoming trip to China. I mean, the great advantage of having a new Sudan strategy that is comprehensive in this nature, that looks at the whole of Sudan, that combines incentives and pressures, is that it offers our special envoy the opportunity to sit down with other countries in a fresh way and to say, look, all of the polarization and the ideology that has prevented meaningful global cooperation in the past, can we put that behind us and look at these shared interests? I think to some degree, all of us have kind of inherited, in the advocacy community, inherited some skepticism, on the basis of seeing a lot of broken promises in the past. The United States government inherits the policies of a prior administration. It's hard to sort of start anew. What this strategy enables Scott to do is to go capital to capital, as he does, with more relentlessness than I can imagine, and have that conversation. And will there be differences? Needless to say, of course, but are they unaccustomed to having the conversation in the way that General Gration starts the conversation? I think yes. And so I think it's like the Obama administration in general, this posture of engagement, this willingness to engage on the basis of mutual interest, as Scott was saying, and mutual respect, I think is a starting point. It doesn't get you all the way there, and that's why it does need to come up at the highest levels. When President Obama has sat down in face-to-face meetings with President Hu in the past, this has always been a topic of conversation. It's an area, an issue of that commands a deep commitment on the part of the president. As soon as the Asia trip was planned, it was clear that this convergence with the release of the strategy and the trip was a great opportunity. And while it would be inappropriate to preempt the president and to predict precisely what will be said, again, on the basis of every other encounter, I think we could be quite confident that this will be an issue that will be raised and that some of the messages that Scott has driven home here today will be brought up at the highest level.
If I could follow up, you mentioned Scott traveling to all of these capitals, and he's one person, he's constantly in motion. What's being done to do some of that work for him in embassies in the capital? And you talked about the president going to China, but then Vice President Biden talks to a lot of people, and of course the Secretary of State herself is constantly traveling. And a lot of us noticed that when she was in Egypt recently and recounted the things she had discussed with the Egyptians, Sudan was not on the list publicly expressed.
Well, I think, it's our job back here at the White House to make sure that senior leaders, when they go abroad, integrate, some of Scott's key asks and key demands. I think we've done that actually very successfully. I'm not aware of the contents of the Egypt consultations, and sometimes there is a discrepancy between what is said publicly and what is said privately, and can check on that. But the Secretary herself, gave up half of her day to stand with Scott and roll out this strategy. She, like the President, like the Vice President, while they were in the Senate, just went so far out on a limb. There's no shortage of an appetite on each of those individuals' parts to be involved. And I think we just have to, you choose your battles carefully. When do you want to wheel out Vice President Biden, get him to make a call? And I think, that's why the great connection that Scott has with the White House is so crucial, because, we follow his lead in terms of when's it really worth it. And I think he's setting some things up now, hopefully, where we may need a Mariano Rivera, we may need a closer, and having the Secretary of State or the Vice President or even the President get involved. They've all made it clear that they're available to Scott, to us, to Ambassador Rice, as well as somebody who's is a crucial weapon in all of this. So, again, there are things that one can be critical of, and the Sudan strategy, I think, took longer to go public with than any of us would have liked. But the commitment on the part of the senior leadership in this administration is unwavering.
Can I just echo something here? I totally agree with what Samantha said. In fact, when Secretary Clinton was in Egypt on her last trip, she called me to pass on some information. Called me directly where I was overseas myself to pass on information that she thought was important to my work in Sudan. The support I've gotten from Secretary Clinton and her staff has just been superb. And of course, President Obama is deeply committed. I mean, as you know, I'm the first full-time envoy. I have tremendous support, tremendous access to the president, and I can't say enough about this administration and the support we've gotten at the cabinet level, at the deputies committee level, and certainly the NSC has absolutely been superb. And it's because of that support that I believe I've been as effective as I have been.
Thank you.
General Gration, activists want to know, when will people in refugee camps in Darfur and Chad have the opportunity to return home? Will it be years, months, weeks, or never?
It's one of those things that I wish I could say it was next week or next month. We can't. We're working so hard to create an environment where they can return voluntarily. That's so important. Secondly, we want to make sure that they can return to an environment where they'll be safe, secure, where the area that they're living in is stable. We also want to make sure that they return with dignity, with human rights, and that they return with everything they need to become successful, whether it's farm implements, whether it's livestock, whether it's the social infrastructure they need for their children to get educated, and health care. We also need to make sure we do this with compassion. Some of these people left their homes as they were being burned down, as their cattle were being destroyed, where some of them even lost family members. This has got to be very tough. And we have to consider, as we look and plan at returning, that we do this with not only dignity, but we do it with compassion. And so I can't predict when it will be, but I want to make sure that all those things are in place before we give them an opportunity to return. The other question is where should they return? Some of their homes are now occupied, so we're going to have to work through that. Some of them have indicated that they've gotten used to living in a community setting, and they might want to move into community settings that are more urbanized. And so we have to think about, how do we plan to build communities that are self-sufficient? And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, while the conditions are not there right now, we must do the planning now, so that when it's time for the 2.7 million people to return, there's a way that they can return and they don't have to fight over resources, that they have what they need to get a new start on life. They deserve it, and we're going to do whatever we can to make sure they get it.
You have mentioned before in the past that a major impediment to refugees being able to return home is psychological stuff. And I was wondering, and activists I think are wondering, if you could explain what you meant by that, and if there are other more significant impediments that you see in place.
Yeah, I mentioned just now the psychological and emotional burdens that many are having. The other thing is, when folks are in IDP camps for 6 years, where they've been dependent on the NGOs to feed them, where they've been dependent on the camp situation, there is bound to be some transitional elements as they think about going out and starting life again, where they have to earn a living and those kind of things. I think we OM is everything we can to make sure they have the skills, but also that emotional support group. This has got to be so very tough. I mean, I've been a refugee myself. We lost everything we had when we left Congo. And I've lived in other people's clothes, and I lived in an attic while we were waiting for a place to move into ourselves. And this is hard. But if we had to go back to a place where I associated with death and destruction, I mean, I just think about it and I say, this has got to be so very hard. And we have to really think about how we're going to do this and care about people and think about the emotional side of this. You know, it's not enough just to bring security and an end to conflict, but we have to think about how we do this and how we reach under and provide that psychological support, that emotional support, so that this is really done in a way that's classy. Not just about getting back so we have numbers going back and people moving back. It's not about that. It's about having people successfully set up their homes and creating an environment where children can grow up and have the benefits of the things that we take for granted without the remnants of the psychological scars. And this is going to be tough. And that's why I'm looking to people that have done this before in Uganda and other places. That's why I'm going to Geneva to ask these questions. It's not just about psychological stuff. It's about understanding so that when it comes time for these people to go back, that we do it in the very best way, and we do it in a way that allows them to be successful as they move back to their homes, wherever that is, wherever they choose to go.
Thank you.
I guess I wanted to not leave that issue just quite yet. I mean, I think everything you said about the trauma that people have suffered will resonate. When that reference to psychological stuff was reported in the Washington Post, it was slightly different. Yeah. And what the Washington Post said was that many displaced Darfurians are dealing with, quote, psychological stuff that is leading to unhelpful mistrust of the government, he said, meaning you said. Yeah. And I think that touches on a larger issue. You were saying verify but trust, but Darfuris definitely do not trust the government. And so I guess my question would be, you know, do you appreciate why they don't, or do you think that there's an unhelpful psychological stuff that's leading to that mistrust?
No, I would say that, first of all, unfortunately, I wouldn't believe everything you read in the paper, and there have been a whole lot of things that have been taken out of context. That, the cookies, smiley faces were grossly taken out of context. And so those things happen. And it's very difficult when you try to condense down a lot of thoughts and concepts into a quick byline or a quick story, that things get taken out of context. And I understand that, and that's just things that happen. I know that people distrust the government. And that's exactly why the easy answer on security is it's the government's responsibility to provide security. It can't happen. Because that's why we're looking at recruiting police from the Darfuri people, training them. That's why we're bringing in UN police people to be buffers. That's why we're looking at all these issues, because we understand totally that distrust. We're thinking the same thing as we're looking at the Mbeki report. How can the Darfuri people raise issues and claims in a court system in a way that they believe that they're getting justice? So we totally understand exactly what you're bringing about. That people that have been subjected to gross human rights violations, people that are living in dire conditions in IDP camps, people that know that they're there because of the government in Khartoum, we obviously understand that there's distrust, and in some cases it's beyond distrust. And those are the kinds of issues we're trying to deal with, because our job is to find a solution that meets their needs and also allows us to work in the context of the Khartoum government, because they hold the power. So we have to be able to bridge that distrust to build an environment where the Darfuris themselves can create a better life for themselves.
The next question is related to that, and I know we're coming near the end, but it has to do with the situation of civilians in Darfur, their current situation. There's kind of a two-part question. The first part is from Renee Lewis of Normal, Illinois. She would like to know how the new Sudan policy is going to play out for the civilians of Darfur. Specifically, what is being done for these individuals in terms of the reinstatement of humanitarian aid. And then Ruth Haida from Shaker Heights, Ohio, says, in particular, how can we help protect the women and girls who leave the camps to get firewood? And maybe I could frame these two questions by saying that you've worked very hard to try to deal with the consequences of the expulsion of humanitarian groups. But I think there's a lot of concern that I would share that you've given the government a lot of credit for averting barely a catastrophe that they set in motion. So in terms of getting that humanitarian aid to people, where does that stand? And are you giving the government too much credit for averting a catastrophe they started?
It's a good point, and thank you very much for that question. Let me just step in and say that while we have been able, as I said before, to get back the health care and the food and some of the sanitation and those kinds of issues, there are many areas where this is being done on a sort of an ad hoc basis, an emergency basis, and is not a sustainable way of doing it.
Your AID colleague in July said it's not sustainable.
Right, and so we're working to do that. And recognizing that even before the INGOs were kicked out, we still had huge gaps. So we have a huge, big problem when it comes to humanitarian assistance that we're working through. The other thing, as I mentioned before, is that we don't have some of the protection groups back. And so we need to work with IOM and folks that are there to expand their capability, to be able to monitor and be able to help us with the protection issues. The other thing we're doing is working with UNIMID to make sure that we set up security zones around each camp. So women can go out, and if they want to collect firewood or have farms or whatever, they can do this without fear of gender-based violence. We're also thinking about how we can put up corridors so as women and families go back on seasonal migration, that they're secure. We're also looking at solar stoves. I had the opportunity to taste rice that was cooked on a solar stove. It's excellent. And there's no flame, and the people don't have to go out and get the firewood. So by working all these programs together, making sure that the INGOs that can help with monitoring and protection, making sure that there's as much security as we can get in the locality of the camps, and making sure that women have other ways of cooking besides having to go get firewood. These are all things, are just simple examples, but I got to tell you, it's a huge problem, it's a huge challenge, and I'm not going to rest until we move a lot farther on than we are right now. We have just begun to scratch the surface, and there's so much more that we have to do on behalf of the women of Darfur.
Layla is going to get to the last question, but let me ask you, yes or no, is one of the benchmarks for the government of Sudan that they allow unimpeded humanitarian access to civilians in need?
Sure, that's our goal.
Is that a benchmark?
Yeah, it's one of those benchmarks that we're looking to figure out how we measure that, because that is so broad that there's areas where UNIMID can't provide protection. I mean, so I guess I wish I could say yes. The answer is yes.
Just say yes.
Yes, but the problem is that it's hard to implement, and I'm sure you understand that Darfur is huge. There's certain areas where the government may not even have control over. We're still having trouble with banditry, we're having trouble with kidnapping, and so we have to keep working through the security issues so that the NGOs and humanitarian assistance can get out to the areas where they need to go.
Thank you.
Thank you. And our last question is, President al-Bashir and his government have been known in the past to say that they will follow a policy or agreement which the UN or other nations have requested to do so, such as minimize civilian attacks or deny weapons to Janjaweed. But only a week later, reports are heard of another attack on a village in Darfur. If President al-Bashir responds in the same way to the new U.S. policy, that is, he says he will follow through but does not hold true to his agreement, then what will the U.S.'s response be, and what will be the plan of action?
That's exactly why we have this strategy, so that we will be able to take a look at all those kinds of things and bring them up to our deputies committees, and if we need to go higher, to the principals and even to the president, that we will put in to, I mean, the question has two parts. If he's doing things that's causing danger to civilian communities and those kinds of actions, we're going to do immediately those actions that the United States and the rest of the international community has to do to stop that kind of violence. But if it's just things that we can work through in a normal process, obviously we're going to do that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it's very hard to answer a hypothetical question. I would tell you in broad terms, if there's benchmarks that we can analyze that don't require immediate action to save lives, then we will work them as we are right now through the DC process. If it's action that we and our international community needs to take immediate action to save lives, we will work through the UN, we'll work through all the multilateral agencies that are available to us, and we'll take whatever actions required bilaterally, or United States, to ensure that people's lives are saved. President Obama was very clear. When I got this job, there had been 13 NGOs that were kicked out. And obviously, he wanted to get those NGOs back in, but he said, your mandate is to save lives. And that's what we did, is we worked very hard to ensure that the 1.2 million people that were at risk from the rainy season were able to survive. And right now, it's the same thing. We have to make sure that people in the southern Sudan that are facing famine, we have to make sure that people that are at risk from intertribal conflict, we have to make sure that people that are still at risk, even in Darfur, that we do everything we can to make sure those lives are saved, and then we make sure that their conditions, their way of life, their surroundings are improved so they no longer have to live in those dire conditions they are right now. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I thank you very much for asking the questions. I thank you so very much for your interest in these issues, and I appreciate you holding us accountable, and I hope we get to do this again, because Sudan is a huge challenge with the elections coming up, the referendum coming up, and all those things we have to accomplish. Yeah, it's going to be tough, but we have no option but to succeed. Failure is not an option for us, and I believe we will succeed. If all of us work together, the students you represent, the people that Jerry represents, the Obama administration, I believe we have a great opportunity to make a difference to a country that deserves a better chance. Samantha?
Who could do better than that? Just want to thank all of you for joining our first WhiteHouse.gov Sudan Town Hall. One of the first questions was on how you would know when benchmarks were met and when incentives and pressures would be deployed. And we said that some of our decision-making goes on behind closed doors, but you all have access to all kinds of information about what's going on in Sudan. Bring to our attention anything you hear from your contacts on the ground. I've never seen a U.S. government official more accessible than General Gration. But we know that we are going to be held accountable by you, and we, as Scott just said, see ourselves as accountable to you. You've done an awful lot already to put this issue right squarely among the priorities of this administration. I wrote a book called The Problem from Hell about the last century's genocides and about how again and again society failed to make noise in the face of genocide and crimes against humanity. You make noise, the noise makes a difference, and we are here. Scott has been appointed, and we have the strategy we do because of you, and we thank you.